So I'll give you an example. So Uber, for example, you can have hundreds of examples, but let's choose Uber, for example. When a data leader will look at Uber, it will say, this is a business which is the pivot of it is built around one piece of data, which is the Google Maps data, which are not Uber not even owns. And that is the premise of building the whole business.
What, if you could sum it up in a nutshell, what is a data culture to you, and how can you really implement one?
Yeah, again, interesting. So data culture is kind of a nebulous, vague entity. We all live in an organization where there's a specific culture, but
Yeah.
we can't define it. So it's one of those. My definition of a data culture as a consultant, I always go to the company and say, tell me the big decisions that you have made in the last X number of years or months, depending on the organization's maturity, and tell me how those big decisions have been backed by data, which data.
Welcome back to episode 9 of the Data Strategist podcast. And today's guest is Sameer Rahman, who is a CEO of a company called DataMonet. Now, we cover off Sameer's career over the past 20 years, which is pretty impressive. It jumps between private and public sector quite a lot. So it's really insightful to see the differences between those two types of industry. We also cover off what is data leadership and why is it going to be important for so many companies. We also look at what is a data culture and why is it important and how is it you can implement one. We also offer advice to people who are trying to become data leaders and have a discussion around that. But most importantly, we cover off data ethics and AI. It's a really insightful podcast, and I thank Sameer for coming on. Now, just an update on the podcast itself. We have around 80% of our viewers not subscribed to the channel. And it's really interesting statistic to see, but I would love it if you could like and subscribe. If you are enjoying it, please hit that button and enjoy this podcast. Thank you very much. Okay, so thank you for tuning into the Data Strategist podcast. Today's guest is Sameer. So who best to introduce yourself than yourself? So let us know who you are, Sameer.
Thanks to it. I'm Sameer Rahman, founder of DataMonet. Have been around the data circles for 20 plus years, working in different guises through different applications and outcomes of data. So quite glad to be talking about data and various aspects of data, and hopefully I can learn from Stuart and the listeners can learn from me on this through this podcast.
That is the goal, my friend. That is the goal. So can you give us a little bit of a career to date? So what have you done over the past? You just mentioned you've been in data for about 20 years. Can you give us some sort of career span of what you've been doing, what you've been up to?
Yeah, I mean, obviously everybody follows their own career span, considering 20 years and stuff like that. Data was born. The data career in data was in its infancy. So the penny really dropped for me back in 2004, 2003, 2004, that kind of period when really I was doing my dissertation for my master's in business administration degree, and I was doing it in Tesco Club Card. My first degree was in computer science engineering. I had always struggled to figure out how engineering and the business world will come together and what skills can I use interchangeably. But the Tesco Club Card was a penny drop moment in terms of how data and the analysis and the insight and knowledge about customers can change their buyer behavior. And then I realized how much coding, statistical skills, analytical skills, which I had learned during my engineering, can turn the tables and completely change the operating model of a behemoth like Tesco. So that is where the penny dropped for me, and that is where I think the seed of okay, this is a good analytical career for me, which can change businesses, and that's how it all started. So, I mean, obviously, going forward, worked in various financial services organizations, Lloyd's, DSB, HBOS, when they were different entities, HMRC in the public sector, before becoming a consultant, before joining Co-Compare as head of data science, which was quite an interesting career. Then moved on to become a consultant for the US and a UK based company, and then moved back to the public sector for the Royal Mint for their digital and data transformation journey. Stayed there for 2.5 years. And then back in 2021, life came full circle and said, okay, why don't I start my own kind of consultancy to help data at a senior level, to bring data to the boardroom, to make sure data literacy is high among data leaders or leaders within the business, and data really becomes the arm, the oil, and the ammunition to make decisions. So that is how Data Monet was born in 2021. So as of now,
Wow.
I am the founder of Data Monet, which is a data science and data strategic consultancy, and I also sit on four different boards as a non-executive director, where I can make a difference through the application of general strategic planning, but also strategic planning through the lens of data. So that's the career to date, Stuart.
Wow, that's a whirlwind of a career, right? I think how have you found moving between public and private sector? Because obviously they move at very different speeds and they have sort of
Mm.
ultimately they have different goals and what they want to achieve. How have you found the difference between the two and jumping between the two throughout your career?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. So the public sector, obviously, there are different outcomes. Public sector is more towards customer experience, societal good, societal kind of community-based outcomes, while the private sector, and I'm generalizing it, but the private sector is more towards commerciality, opening up new revenue streams, operation saving on operational costs. So the difference is in the mindset really as to and also the risk appetite of how to use data. When I worked in the public sector company, they were very risk averse in terms of, okay, we can take baby steps, we can evolve, we can iterate, but we don't need to completely rehaul or completely change. And the innovation quotient through the use of data in the public sector was probably less than what it was in the public sector. Sorry, in the private sector. The private sector was much more, as long as you give me the outcomes, the commerciality, and you illustrate the business case, the bandwidth of what you could do was much more. So
Mm.
again, the innovation quotient through data, the risk quotient was much more. You were given a leverage to a lot more and go a lot more forward with it. That's the kind of fundamental difference I would say I found between the two.
I think that's really interesting, the risk appetite, because that is something that I've come across myself. Um, Another aspect of it is the speed.
Mm,
So with public sector, it is a lot slower to private because private, because of that mindset, like you said, the commerciality is you have to get a feature out very quickly. You have to capitalize on it. You have to make an ROI on it. Whereas in the
yeah,
public sector, it's all about making sure it's correct. And there's probably bureaucracy that sits in that as well within the public sector to make sure that we're not doing anything too advantageous or too
yeah.
outlandish is probably a word I would say. Um, so yeah, that's a really interesting. Have you come across that though, the speed difference and how you have to change yourself as well?
Yeah, I think the speed is very valid point. I think it's all goes back to the data leadership kind of thing, and or the leadership within those sectors as to what they're trying to achieve, how trusting they are of the data within the company. And also there's a bit of history and lineage. Public sectors have come through more of a less data led kind of leadership, so they haven't they don't trust the data in the way. So you'll go through multiple hoops and business cases before you sign off something as basic as, I don't know, maybe a CRM system or a data lake or something like that. While in private sector these things are a given, in terms of, yeah,
Yeah,
I know you need to store, manage, govern the data, so just go away and do it, that kind of thing.
yeah, that's true. I think you're right, and it is bureaucracy at the end of the day that leads that. And I think that because they are spending sort of public money, they're not
Yeah,
spending private money. It
yeah,
is more of a we can't spend money on that because that doesn't add customer value in
that's right.
the front of house, if you like. It's more
Yeah,
the back house and how we actually manage the operation is different.
yeah.
It's a really different mindset. And it's interesting to hear someone else jumping through between private and public sector. I think that's really insightful. So thanks for that.
Mm.
Um, so you set up Data Monet, but I'll give you another opportunity to plug what Data Monet is. So can you give us a bit more of a? It's a consultancy, but what sets it out about everything else, and what are you passionate about with Data Monet?
I think the passion is, as I said, getting data in the boardroom. That's the passion. Wherever there is an organization where the data can be a catalyst for a change, or the senior leadership is really sort of Either they don't know how to use the data, they don't know how to make how to maximize and optimize data as an asset. uh, that is where that is where Data Monet set in. It is data at the boardroom. So my clients within Data Monet are usually CEOs or any other C-suite, but usually the CEOs. 80% of my client are CEOs, and they are at a crossroads where I know I can do a lot with data. I can do with the digital and data transformation. I just don't know how to go about it. I just don't know what business value it'll become. It'll give me. I just don't know how it'll give me the ROI and how it'll impact the multiple stakeholders. So it's kind of giving them the roadmap and really making data omnipresent within discussions, uh, making it a first class citizen, as my website will say, and bringing it, making it mainstream. Essentially, data at the
Right.
moment is an off. Sometimes it can be an afterthought. I want to make data mainstream within the board, within the executive team, such as functions like HR, like marketing, like finance, IT. Data has still some way to go in becoming a mainstream function. And I see that in the way non-executive committees and things like that are set up. There's no particular fit for data in one of those committees. So I am there with data through Data Monet. I'm trying to take that kind of charge of saying, make data the mainstream. Data is so much important. It is a first class citizen. It is a function that should be inherently built into within your business culture. And you should be talking about it like any other function. So that's the purpose.
I think many companies still have data as a subset of technology or IT,
Yeah.
um, which has its benefits. But I think what I've seen over the last few years is companies are now splitting those two roles out. You have your technology, which is your systems, which is your security, which is sort of the day to day operation. And then they're
Hmm.
separating out into this data leadership space. So you have sometimes it's at senior leadership level, sometimes at head of level, or it's at board level. And I think
Hmm.
what I'm enjoying seeing is the chief data officer role coming up through the
Yeah.
ranks and becoming more prevalent across public sector, especially. Um, that's really that's really interesting that you're meeting people and trying to get them to think a bit differently, because I think that's what this is all about. At the moment, we are sort of behind in that sort of data leadership space,
Yeah.
and you know, moving nicely on to another question we've got, which is, could you just describe for people what is data leadership and why is it important to companies? We've kind of touched a little bit on it now, but give it a bit more of a body to that.
I would always say data leadership is it's about strategic. So it is strategy leadership, just looking at strategy from a data lens. That's how I see data leadership. You have to be very commercially minded. So I'll give you an example. So Uber, for example, you can have hundreds of examples, but let's choose Uber, for example. When a data leader will look at Uber, it'll say, this is a business which is the pivot of it is built around one piece of data, which is the Google Maps data, which not Uber not even owns, and that is the premise of building the whole business. So that is how the data, from a data leader perspective, I look at Uber and say, this is purely a data business. From a data leadership, I will look at this business and I'll say, somebody very data literate has been able to form this business. And similarly, Google, Facebook, all of those had no commercial arm. Google did not have a PPC, Facebook did not have its advertising arm. They are all built on the data that we give them. So that is how I see data leadership, looking at very commercial aspect of what data can help to commercialize to become a revenue stream to serve customers at the end. Because Uber serves customers, Google serves a certain appetite for the customers, so does Facebook. And I know I'm highlighting major corporations. There are many smaller ones who do the same thing. But data leadership to me is very much opening up, very much strategic consultancy, very much opening up new revenue streams, just looking things from a different angle, very much clarifying the vision from a data perspective, and very much an outcomes and a solutions oriented approach, saying what solution from a data lens can you provide a customer or a stakeholder which makes their lives better, and how do you use data within that cookbook of that solution. I would also say Data leadership, as you referred to earlier, is very much about data storytelling. It's a case of how do you tell that story, saying it is about strategic leadership. And I found that on the board table every day. It's about people think of leadership as something different. I see leadership from a very different perspective in terms of you have to have this solutions mindset. So data leadership, again, encapsulating it in one sentence to it, will be strategic consult consultancy, strategic leadership, just looking things from a data perspective, data lens.
So would you say then that that is the responsibility of a CEO, or do they need to have specific, like a chief data officer or a chief technology officer with data underneath? How do you sort of see that playing out? Because a CEO has got many facets, right?
Yeah,
He or she cannot really rely on knowing every aspect of the business in that much depth. So the executive team that they form around them, you have a chief technology officer that's been around for years.
yeah.
But what about the role of a chief data officer? Or do you see a chief technology officer as that same person?
No, so very good question. So the chief data officer, I see their role as championing and cheerleading the data function, so the data leadership. They are the ones who champion it, who make everybody aware of data leadership across the board table, across the executive team, across people who are middle managers. So it's kind of, they then educate the board on how decisions are being made and how data is being used and develop, and they are basically the catalyst of developing the culture within the organization. That is a truly data driven culture where decisions are made backed by data and insight. So I see that role as quite pivotal in educating the CEO and educating other parts. Uh, and they bring that kind of optimization culture all across. So they are the ones who drive the literacy. They are the ones who drive the culture. They are the ones who st- st- basically cheerlead and steward the data function and bring it to life within the organization.
So they're the ones that add the value and the insight to the CEO to make those business decisions.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
it also very much depends on the maturity of the business, because you start off with a centralized model where there's a data team, a CDO, they then emanate their kind of influence across the organization. Once that becomes done, it becomes a decentralized function where you still have a CDO, but everybody becomes data literate to an extent, and so on and so forth. So it's that kind of culture that starts off centrally, but then it's like the spokes of a wheel, really. You start
Yeah.
off in the middle and then you develop that.
Well, that again, we've kind of touched on it already, but data culture is an interesting one for me personally, because I think that people struggle with the idea of data, because when we talk about implementing data techniques or when we talk about automation, it's kind of a
Mm,
key word. People
mm.
automatically go backwards and go back into their shell and go, that's going to take my job, right? When we think about that. But a data culture should be one that everyone pulls in the same direction. But I really want to get your thoughts on what, if you could sum it up in a nutshell, what is a data culture to you and how can you really implement one?
Yeah, again, interesting. So data culture is kind of a nebulous, vague entity. We all live in an organization where there's a specific culture,
Yeah.
but we can't define it. So it's one of those. My definition of a data culture as a consultant, I always go to the company and say, what was tell me the big decisions that you have made in the last X number of years or months, depending on the organization's maturity, and tell me how those big decisions have been backed by data. Which data set, what insight, what market intelligence, what customer research, different guides and shades of data have you used to arrive at that decision, and show me the business case of those decisions. That's one way of assessing how good, how mature your data culture is, because how much of a pivot is data in making those decisions. That's the thing for me that drives and gives me an idea of a maturity assessment of a data culture. So that's number one. And then obviously there are things around I mean, you would look at an organization and look at how the board meetings are run, how the executive meetings are run, what value, what kind of space data has in that. You look at the reports from different executive team, and you will instantly find out if a chief marketing officer is talking about, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but talking about branding, advertising, with no reference to how they optimize, how they measure, and things like that, then you'll instantly figure out this is not a culture that drives data driven culture. Similarly, with commercial product development teams, what is going into, what kind of insight is going into that product development, how is that being developed through and through, how structured that process is, how dynamic that process is, and how what market information has gone through and all that. So you could do, so for me the data culture is where data is a pivot. You look at the reporting, you look at the discussions in the boardroom, and you figure out how much of that pivot is working for you, how much of that decision making is led by some data or insight, and that drives that culture. It's the old saying of culture eats strategy for breakfast. I would just add that data culture will eat a non-data led strategy for breakfast, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's really insightful to think of it that way. When it happens a lot, and I think one thing that we may have not touched upon is the trust in the data. So
Yeah,
we may see a marketing officer, a chief marketing officer, present something, but how the first instance should be, do we trust that data? That's kind of the first sort of challenge people have: is where'd you get that
yeah,
data from? Why have you got it? And some places that is really challenging in
yeah.
embedding that trust and that culture of trust, because a lot of people don't use the systems that they're given. They work off system, so the data
Mm,
that's generated never actually exists. So when you're presented facts and data back, you instantly go, yeah, well, my spreadsheet says different. How
yeah.
does that sort of play out in your mind when it comes to sort of trust in data itself?
But trust, yeah, absolutely. Trust in data is a big thing. Some people sadly use it as a scapegoat, saying, look, within the data world, good enough is the new perfect. Okay. If you look at 100% purity, accuracy, validity, reliability, trust within data, you're not going to get it. But good enough is kind of, if it's 90% there, 95% there, if you've got sufficient confidence. Going back to your CDO question, the link between the two is within a medium to large size organization, a CMO or CCO or CO should make their CDO as a companion, because a CDO is that kind of hallmark saying, okay, I am giving you my stamp of approval that the data you're using in your reports, in your insights, in your function as a whole comes from the right source, comes from the right system, is high quality or decent quality, and basically you are interpreting the data in the right way. So that is where the CDO plays a very fundamental role in creating that trust across various functions. If the CDO doesn't give you that hallmark, and then if a CMO or a CCO or a CEO presents that data, which is fine as long as they fully trust it, and as long as the CDO doesn't come back and says, okay, your data is incomplete, I don't trust it. But I think a lot of people, not marketers, a lot of marketers have fallen foul of, they've gone into meetings and they've given their own data, their own take of things, uh, and then later on find there's multiple versions of the truth, the data doesn't sit in single place, there's more questions around versions of the truth and where the data is coming from than the insight that needs to be the focus of attention. So I think the CDO plays a very important role in this to it, and he should be the mark of approval, and he should be putting his whole mark on these things.
What if what if a company doesn't have one? What if they don't have a CDO? How do they? Because not all companies will want to have a chief data officer. It's not
Yeah.
viable for them. Um, does that fall when you don't have that? When the conversations in the boardroom generally focus around tech,
Hmm.
HR, and operations, how do you ensure that that conversation without a CDO there is going to happen? Because if they're not there, who's there to champion it?
Yeah.
How do
So
you how would you
yeah.
advise a company that's not going to invest in the CDO? Let's say no CDO. How do we make sure that that conversation still happens?
Yeah. So obviously, the company with a no CDO will have somebody who will manage and govern the data, and who knows, typically it has been either a database administrator, that kind of person, or it's an old term, or some sort of data governor, or kind of who manages the data, so data quality person or a data analyst. Normally for smaller companies, they always rely on a data analyst to tell them where the data comes from and if data is reliable. There has to be somebody at some level, middle management level, to tell them about that. But more importantly, I think if you do not have a senior person cheerleading it, then you have to cheerlead it, as long as you're confident that the data is coming from the same source. So for a typical CMO position, presenting the marketing plan and the roll off and the ROI, and having a business justification for marketing for the next year, they have to go into that meeting backed by that data analyst, saying my analyst has given me this particular kind of ROI calculation, which gives another level of trust, because the analysts shouldn't work in the marketing team; they work outside, so they're an independent piece of advice that is being taken on board. And also the CMO has to be very kind of data literate themselves, if they're and they have to champion and showcase that the business case is based on a very proper commercial backing. Because if it's not based, they are presenting a business case which they themselves are not sure about. So, in answer to your direct answer to your question, there has to be some middle management intervention, independent intervention, who doesn't work in that particular team, to have an independent review, an independent kind of uh, confidence, giving the CMO or the CCO or the CEO the confidence that the data that they are using is the right data set to use in the right way.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Interesting you say there that they're like an independent function. What I always call any team that I create in data, we are Switzerland. That's our role within the company. We are not there to have an opinion or a gut
Yeah,
feel about something. We are there as the auditors of the company or the evidence gatherers for the company. We're not
yeah,
there to tell them we think this is a good idea. We are there to tell them this could be a good idea if these
yeah.
factors play into it. And I think it's really interesting that companies are starting to realize that. But when they're early on outsetting these sorts of teams, they kind of miss the point of what a data function should be. And
Mm,
in my opinion, it should be that Switzerland. We are that neutral reference point for everybody in the organization. Is that
yeah.
something that you agree or disagree with? I'd like to know your
I,
thought on it, though.
I, I mean, it is very much dependent on the maturity of the organization. I do agree with. I think we are. I definitely agree with. We are a neutral. We should be a neutral reference point. I definitely agree with that. What I would say is, for data function to grow in a position of later leadership, you have to cross that bridge of, okay, I'm no longer just a neutral function who gives my view, or who just does the work for the marketing function or the operations function. Now I look at my data, I can see the market insight, I can see the outliers, I can see the trends, and I can see how that can affect new business propositions and revenue and things like that. So I am also using my data head to become a commercial person and advising the
Mm.
business of what new product to develop. I think it's that bridge the data leaders have to cross. Otherwise, we'll still be in that utility enabler kind of mode, and we'll never get into the boardroom.
That is true. I think understanding that we are there to one, provide that neutrality, but also to be the recommendation engine of the company is
Exactly.
what the data team should be. And I think
Yeah. And
that's a
innovation.
hard innovation. Yeah, that's interesting because I think innovation comes in many formats.
It
And I
does.
think it does depend on the organization you work in. In the public sector, innovation can be quite difficult because you are bound by the risk appetite that we talked about earlier,
Yeah. Yeah.
and the fact that there's too many moving parts. So you're not necessarily not one team is responsible for the whole process. So if you
Mm.
think about innovation, you innovate a process or you innovate you're not going to build a new product. I'm talking public sector now, not
Yeah.
private. You're
Mm.
not going to innovate a new product or a new feature. You are
Mm.
innovating process and system thinking. is what you're there to do, and that gets quite hard in public sectors because
Yeah.
they are quite siloed, yet they are part of the same process. So I think innovation's difficult in the public sector space for those sorts of reasons, but it
Yeah,
shouldn't
I
be
think
avoided,
it
is
should
what I
be
should say.
avoided. And as I said, Stuart, it's very much what public sector are we talking about? So when we were at the Royal Mint, for example, a particular innovation was we were looking at our precious metals, which is our gold division, and we were looking at environmental ESG kind of proposition, and we find out, okay, so within our gold and within mobile phones, there's a gold kind of chip, and we
Mm.
can recycle that and use that to develop new to recycle gold and then to sell that gold and all that kind of stuff. So it can be, I mean, innovation, as you said, innovation comes in various shapes and guises, and we were not taking a lot of risk apart from using a little bit of a different manufacturing skill set to do the same. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a mindset thing. Public sector, yes, very restricted, yes, less so than private sector. I think the point I'm trying to make is whichever organization you're part of, you should not think that you cannot innovate. I mean, I always say the outliers of today will be the norm of tomorrow. So
Mm.
you are at a position where you're seeing all the data, all kinds of data. You can interpret what the business might look like in 5, 10 years time much better than anybody else who hasn't got access to all that. And how do you make use of that is your word through that recommendation engine, and I'll add recommendation and innovation engine, whichever is ideal for that particular context of that organization.
Yeah, when I say it's difficult, it's more that it's not just the data function that does it.
Yeah.
It's more of a entire company-wide approach. If you've got the right culture and the right CEO
Yeah.
in any company, whether that's public or private, you will be able to innovate. Where it struggles is where there's many different sort of strategic directions that a
Yeah, they're
leadership team can
competing
take.
priorities, and as you said, they have to spend the money responsibly. It's not just about commerciality. It's
Yeah,
about
yeah,
so there is a this set of expectations that a business case had, an innovative business case has to meet, and that set of expectations is very different, very complex as compared to the private sector. Wholeheartedly agree.
yeah. Okay, brilliant. Oh, we've covered quite a lot in quite a short period of time.
Yeah.
I feel like we've got so much to talk about. So I guess a nice thing to move on to is what advice would you give to other data leaders? So people who are heads of data, directors of data, CDOs, or anybody who's interested in becoming one of those. So maybe moving from a CTO or a director of technology into a chief data officer, chief tech, or chief um, information officer. What sort of advice would you give them, and even CEOs, I guess, if they want to become more data literate? What's your advice to them?
I think, I mean, look, data, I mean, the advice I would give them is, again, data is not a function. Data is something that is ingrained within the business, and data is business value. I mean, I am a big proponent. At one point, about a couple of years ago, I was shouting and lobbying and saying data should be on the balance sheet because you have brand value on the balance sheet, and you have a so every there's a brand, there's a nominal value attached to a brand. There should be a nominal value attached to a company's data assets. I mean, obviously, there are multiple hoops in terms of how you use the data, what quality, and
Mm,
part of the data is unused. But there has to be something. So I am of the very firm opinion it's an asset. Data is an asset. How you look at that asset is what CDO's role is in terms of the advice I would give to the CDOs is go with a very business, as I said, strategy, business, commercial, business value mindset. Don't go with this is my data, look, this can do this. Flip it around, have a very outcome and a solutions based mindset. If there's a pain point or an opportunity within the business, tell the CEO, tell the executive team how data can help solve that pain point, or how data can basically develop that new product, that new revenue stream. Unless you're dealing with pound figures or dollars or euros, whichever country you're working in, you will still remain an unknown entity where you say, okay, there's data over there. let's talk about commercial, and we'll talk about data later. Data is not non-commercial. Data is a very commercial entity. The CDO's role is to bridge that gap and to educate leaders on how data can become that commercial entity. We kept saying data is a new oil for 5, 10 years now,
Yeah, we,
but but nobody has said how that oil is actually making you money. Really, how that oil is running the machinery, running the car engine. That is
yeah,
what the CDO. That is what the CDO's role is. Forget about data as a new oil. Tell them how that oil is being used to run that engine.
yeah. I've heard that term quite a lot, and then I heard data is the new soil, and I was like, okay, this is going a different avenue now, where everything grows from data. But I think um, I think that's really interesting advice that you would give to people. I think what I would say to that is make sure that you are doing that as a leader, because
Absolutely.
it's easy to say, well, it's a very easy thing to say, we are data driven, but are you really adding that value to the data? Are you giving it that time in the boardroom? Are you giving it that sort of appreciation that it does have in other successful companies? And
Mm.
when I've joined a few companies in the past where they didn't realize they had a data asset,
Yeah.
which blows my mind. Someone who's in data, you kind of just like, yeah, well, this is, you could do all this with it. This is what you can actually achieve if you use data. And when you speak to some CEOs and CTOs, they go, you can do what? How is that even possible? So that there's those light bulb moments that people need
Yeah.
to realize. But it's the implementation. And implementation is an interesting one, because when I think about, you mentioned it earlier, around centralizing your data function to then decentralize. Now, I've spoken to a few data leaders along the way, and I've worked with some great ones as well. And I think that's a
Mm.
really great model to have, is to actually understand that there is a central function that's needed to maintain the data quality, maintain the data stream, and then provide analytics to the company. Then, when your data literacy is at a certain point, you can start pushing this culture out into the
Yeah.
operation. So, like you said, a hub and spoke sort of model.
Mm.
We did
Mm.
that at Centrica, and it was really successful. But to do that, you have to centralize first.
Absolutely.
There's You can't put loads of data analysts all over the business, because they kind of just go, well, they compete with each other then, and that's not a very good process to have, or a culture to have. You need that sort of centralized function to decentralize later on. And I think
Absolutely.
if somebody, the advice I would probably say is do that first. Centralize all of your data people, because the hidden cost, especially in public sector, is people are doing data work, whether that is in spreadsheets, whether that is, manual data entry. All of this work is still being done across your company. So
Mm.
you're already spending the resource, you just don't know it.
Yeah.
So when you centralize it, it's not about losing jobs at this point. This is about centralizing a skill set to build that data culture. And I guess that
Yeah.
data is the new soil then, because it grows into a nice tree and you've decentralized. So I've done a full circle there on what I think.
Yeah.
Um,
Good one.
how do you think about that? So the central to decentral approach, is that
Yeah, I
something
mean,
you've
yeah, that's
seen done?
yeah. I mean, when most organizations that I've worked as a data leader, Go Compare being an example, the whole data science team, we centralized even with developers and kind of whole kind of end-to-end data team. And then we made the organization quite self-sufficient, self-serve, educated them on the normal BI. And then eventually, when I left, it was an analyst, a senior level analyst, dotted around every function. So there was a marketing, it's 2 or 3 marketing analysts because it's a big marketing team. There's a commercial analysis in the commercial function. There was a product analyst, and so on and so forth. So there were senior level analysts dotted around every function. The centralized team was still there, but not in its entity. It had me as head of data science. It had a few other data science predictive modelers and things like that, because that wasn't needed for decentralization. But really, we decentralized. The benefit of decentralization was also that that particular commercial analyst became quite market aware of the commerciality. So they were
Mm-hmm.
very aware of the commercial aspect. The marketing understood how PPC worked, how TV worked, how the branding worked. So they were they were making careers out of their own. So one of them now has become more of a head of marketing rather than a head of data, which is absolutely fine. But there are benefits to the people from that function as well. But wholeheartedly agree. I think centralization, to gain that trust, to showcase what you can do with data, to try to automate and self-serve, and once the organization is at that maturity level, then you start to decentralize. It's a long game, but it's a game well worth it, where you have a lot of business value and dividends at the end.
So you've mentioned it twice now, self-serve, right? I always found that an interesting sort of proposition because when we talk to executives or we talk to people across businesses,
Mm,
self-serve in their mind is like the Minority Report, where they will pull data from all these different sources and create these wonderful reports. But in essence, that's not necessarily what we're saying when we say self-serve. Um, I could give you my opinion, but I'd like to hear what do you mean by self-serve when you say it?
so what I mean by self-service, if I'm sitting in my function, let's say I am a chief commercial officer or head of commercial, whatever, let's middle management and commercial, I want to present a business case. I know I require one particular data set in that business case, or I'm doing my reporting to my, I'm head of commercial, I'm doing my reporting to my chief commercial officer. I know how to fetch how best to present that report. I know what data goes into that report. I know where that data sits, and I know I'm self-sufficient within my either me as a person or within my team to produce that in the most trusted way. So I'm self kind of sufficient in a way to to get that information, that insight across, and I'm fully confident that that's the right interpretation, that's the right data, and that's the right way to produce it. That's how I would say self-serve.
Okay. So can we dive a little bit further into that? I know it's not a question we said we'd talk about, but I think
No,
it's
that's fine.
really it's an
Yeah, it's
interesting
important.
it's an interesting concept because self-service was massive. Let's say 5 years ago, self-service was the number one buzzword that people were using, especially around business intelligence.
Mm.
Um, the way I think about it is more the practicality of, let's say your head of strategy, do they have Power BI and access to a tabular model or a schema that they can pull data in, or is it that they know enough about the data to ask the right questions where an analyst would then provide them the data? How do you,
It's a
is it
latter
both?
one. So remember, we are talking about the decentralized model in my head anyway. To talking about the decentralized model, where the head of commercial has got a commercial analyst who
Okay.
has come from a centralized analytical team, having learned and gone through that, and now he sits within the commercial team. So they are the right hand man or woman, helping the head of strategy. The head of strategy, exactly to your point, asks the right questions, which they should be doing considering their role, and then and then the commercial analyst answers that question and gives the right data. So that's how I see it.
Right. Okay. So, okay, good. I think we're aligned then. Because when people hear us talk like this, they generally think that as a executive, as a head of, I should be able to go in and start pulling information
No,
into a report. The problem that that leads to is you will not correctly
no.
produce the data you're looking for. You
Yeah,
will create a caveated approach to the data. You're not asking a question that could be answered. You are answering, you've already asked about 6 questions before you got to that point.
yeah.
So you're pulling in caveated information.
It's I mean, to me, self-serve is part of it. Every person cannot be self-serve. Self-serve is that function is self-serve with an analyst within that function. So somebody asks the right question, somebody provides the right data, somebody interprets, and within that function you come to the right conclusion, and then you present that to whoever you want to present.
Yes. Good. I was half expecting us to go into a full-on debate and argument
Debate over
about.
there.
Oh no, you cannot be the Minority Report. That is not a real thing. Maybe in 10, 20 years that could be a real thing, but now it's definitely not.
I
It's
don't think it'll be
more,
a real thing because people have got their own capabilities, their own kind of the way of thinking, and not everybody will become an analyst. So, and not everybody will become a creative. If you ask me to develop a graphic or an art, I'll never get to that stage, no matter how
well,
much.
that's true, apart from stable diffusion, which has now come in, and that leads us. It's like we planned this, Samir.
Yeah.
It is like we planned it. It now we talk about data ethics and AI. So we have got things like stable diffusion. So you've got ChatGPT, which is
Mhm.
natural language processing. Data ethics are going to become more important in this new strategic world than ever before. And I think Martin Lewis, the money expert, said that the data strategist is going to be the number one career in the next decade
Mm.
because of this very question around why do we use data? Why do we use AI? How are we using it? So I would love to hear. This is an open-ended question for you, really, to give us sort of that strategic thought about data ethics and AI because now it's in public domain. So
Yeah.
how do we embrace ourselves or make ourselves aware of it?
I think it's a very, as I said, it's a very deep question, really, isn't it? I mean, I remember when I was working, I think it was must have been 10 years ago. And this was obviously the French retailer Target. They had a uh, very high PR case study on data ethics 10 years ago, where a girl goes into their shop. She shops frequently, and then obviously Target collects shopping behavior and then sends a letter saying congratulations on your pregnancy, things
Ah,
like that.
yes, I remember this. Yeah,
You
yeah,
remember
yeah.
this? Yeah. And then the girl didn't properly know she was pregnant. She had some feeling. The girl's parents obviously didn't know they were pregnant, and the father really saw that letter, complained to Target, saying this is all basically not right and all that kind of stuff. Turned out the girl was pregnant. So basically, it's a very clever predictive modeling, taking behavior and shopping data to predict outcomes, life outcomes, but it crosses the data ethics miles into what they shouldn't have done.
Mm,
So I think the question, the reason I said that yesterday, the question is there's a very fine line between cleverness, greed, commerciality, and ethics. Yes, if you mine all the data, you will know more about me than I do about myself. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But what is are you benefiting? How are you benefiting me as a person ethically? Is the question. I think with ChatGPT, with all the other technologies around, ethics is a human nature. Really, the data strategist is a human, and as part of data strategies, you have to think what human impact are you making, what kind of are you making are you making their lives better, are you giving them some sort of gripe, do they want to disclose what you've figured out from your data. So all the ethical nature of the consideration needs to go into a data strategy, saying okay, we can collect all that data, we can predict a lot about their future, we can tell them a lot more than they don't, and we can make a buzz out of that, and we can sell them the right product. But should you, and at what point do
yeah.
they draw the line between greed and ethics? I think greed and ethics is I think it's all because of greed. There has to be a value exchange, which as data people we have always kind of stuck to that. Why are you collecting that data? What will you do? What's the value exchange? And if the value exchange is proven, customers will give their data. But now you're collecting data left, right, and center without customers not realizing it. So they don't realize the value exchange. We have gone above that. Now you're playing a kind of a data ghost kind of thing where you're collecting all that, you're doing a lot of insight, customers don't know about it. But should you, even if you learn about it, should you play back, should you not play back, is it ethical enough? So think about your own morality, your own, would you want that kind of data to be treated on your own personality, on your own family? So your morality has to be built within that data strategy is how I feel it.
So you would see it down to not just data leaders. You would see that down to coders, developers, right the way through
Absolutely.
to make sure that they. That's an interesting one because that's a hard thing to do. I mean, when you've got a chief marketing officer, chief commercial, chief product officer, chief data officer, whoever, and they're pushing for you to create that recommendation engine, you know, it's a hard thing to say no because.
Yeah,
Your job is then on the line. You are then
yeah, yeah.
then you come
You're
to that pivotal point of, do I sacrifice my job and my income over a data ethical thing, which if we don't do it, someone else probably will.
But that is where the greed and ethics meet, really, isn't it? You where do you, I mean, within the target case study, they didn't do the right thing, but they were clever enough. The case study is still being highlighted as how clever they were in terms of how. But also at the other end, they lost a lot of reputation because they were greedy. They didn't do. They were
Mm,
unethical, immoral. So yes, the CMO, or in your case, the CMO has to decide what's immoral and what's not, and there are commercial pressures, business pressures, and all of us. At the same time, I think yes, they should think, but also there should be a culture within their team as a function where you open up and say, not point blankly, this is immoral and I'm not doing it, but have a discussion saying what we are playing back. Either we haven't collected the data in the right way, or we haven't taken the permission, or we haven't stuck to the customer didn't instruct. And there's a lot of GDPR principles ethically, if you want to, the customer didn't instruct us to use the data in this particular way, so why are we
mm.
doing it? So there's a lot of interesting discussions, not arguments, discussions you can have with your senior leader, and the senior leader should develop that culture, saying, okay, I've said something, I might have missed out on something. If my team doesn't bring that to my attention, in Target's case, if somebody would have said, look, what you're doing, the parents might not know, and it's quite early in the phase, so are we sure we want to do it? They might have had second thoughts about it, they might not, but it's again that balance of greed and immorality. So I think it's a culture within the team that you need to develop so that everybody opens up on that.
Yeah. Culture plays a massive importance to everything that we do, from strategy right the way through to ethics. I think it's a fascinating conversation to have because it's so broad. And
Mm,
like you said, so many companies have so much data about us. If you think of the likes of Experian or any other company like TransUnion, they have thousands of data points on us. And like
mm,
you said, they'll know us better than we know ourselves. And then if you go to the likes of Google and Facebook, who provide a service to us. So we're happily going, here, Facebook, know exactly where I am and who I'm texting, what I'm doing at all times, because I can speak to my friend.
yeah,
That's really all the service they give you, is just the ability to communicate with others and show pictures and share pictures. But the amount of data they track, do they need to know where you are at all times? Do they need to know the
yeah,
sentiment of your conversation at all times? Probably not, but they do it for that greed and commerciality that's probably
yeah,
there. I think greed's an interesting one on how you play it back though, because I think companies, they are private companies, whether we like it or not. They are private companies, and you
mm,
can't rely on greed, them to hone in the greed.
yeah,
That you can't. I don't think I've ever seen a product officer or a commercial officer go, "I don't really want to make that much money." I think the profit margins always shoot up, and especially when you come to data, you can manipulate it to make much more
mm.
more money in a company. So yeah, the greed one I think is a really interesting
I
facet
think
to
it's
it.
it's that immorality and greed balance to it. As I said, I mean, you can go just with greed, and you like the Target case study, you can be imposed with a fine, you can have reputational damage because you've crossed that morality boundary. So a good senior commercial person should be very, very, very careful uh,
Mm.
to tread that balance.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I I've absolutely loved this discussion today, Samir. I think it's been really insightful. I think people will understand a lot more about why we need more data people in the boardroom, or data conversations and data led
Hmm,
conversations. So thank you for coming on. I think it's
great.
been absolute blast to meet you and to hear your thoughts on it. And hopefully we'll have you on again soon. I think there's lots more to discuss. I think we got a lot on the table to try and discuss. But I
Yeah, it's a
think
pleasure. It's a very good discussion.
brilliant. Thank you for watching the latest episode on the Data Strategist podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it. They've been fantastic to do. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button and watch the next video just over here. Thanks again. Speak to you again soon.